Hello, WAP students. Um, so usually I try to record these at work, but it's I didn't have time this week, so I'm going to record it in my house. Kind of a throwback to pandemic, if you really have any fond memories of when you're eighth grade year, right? Okay, so our chapters this week cover kind of our tale of kind of two historiographies. Africa is a very skinny chapter, while the Europe and does not give enough information to be useful, and the Europe chapter gives far too much to actually really highlight the imbalance. And while WAP has become less Eurocentric since we cut out half of European history, half the first half of world history, we still have somewhat Eurocentric bias in the content. So we're going to start with our 1.5, which are just about developments in Africa. And what's really important about Africa is that, especially sub-Saharan, well, there's a big geographical boundary that separates African state development from Eurasian state development, and that's the Sahara Desert, where eventually states develop the means to cross the desert through camels, and that's the trans-Saharan trade route. But what's really important is that the states of Africa develop complexity. But what's interesting about the states of Africa is that complexity is different than Eurasian states, and actually, in a lot of ways, is comparable to American states that are developing on this period because they're developing independent of external influences. A lot of these states are kind of figuring out how to do state things and government things without the influence of external forces beyond regional states. But then what also comes in Islam, and that ends up really influencing a lot of West Africa and East Africa as well. Okay, so here is our first term page. You'll pause me, write it down. So, not just first, only term page. So it's only 12 terms for this chapter. So now we're going to go into our first subtopic, which talks about inland Africa. So inland Africa is we have Africa, that little, like, I don't know, pistol shape. Sometimes I think of the shape of Africa like a pistol pointing down. We're talking about the middle of Africa, right directly south of the Sahara Desert. Typo. So in general, what we're going to see in most African states is a degree of political decentralization, that governments impact people's lives, but are far less important in the everyday lives of people than they become in the post-classical era in other parts of Eurasia, even in America. One of the cultural links between these people is they all speak a language or languages descended from this larger thing called Bantu. And the Bantus actually are people who originate from inland Africa and migrate not only regionally, but also eventually all the way down to southern Africa. So, like, the Zulu tribe is also a Bantu-speaking tribe as well, and that's an ethnicity that persists even to this day. But during this period of 1200 to 1450, states like the Hausa Kingdom become more centralized and more complex than states that preceded them. Most of these states operated along kin-based networks, which means that states were administered by and followed along some kind of lineage, that there was a male head of these kin-based networks, and that was called a chief. So typically, you were governed by some kind of relation. It could be quite distant, actually, in this part of Africa, but you still were governed by someone who you had some kind of relation to. And the illustrative example that WAP gives us, or AMSCO gives us, is the Hausa Kingdom. They're all these. It's a bunch of different kingdoms that are loosely connected to kinship ties. They're inland, so they don't really connect with any kind of water-based or sea-based trade along the Atlantic or Atlantic or Indian Ocean coast. Eventually, they do become integrated into your Afro-Eurasian economics through this trans-Saharan trade that comes to them from the north. Now, because they were relatively decentralized, that means that when they become more integrated and people become aware of them, they're more vulnerable to external threats, right? Centralization gives a state the means to kind of coordinate all the resources that are under a state's control more effectively. But when you're decentralized, those resources are distributed across all these different interest groups, which means that like your military force might be a conglomeration of several tribes or groups working together, and that means they have their different command structures. They're not going to work together. Some tribes might have different ways of fighting or stuff like that, and so they're more vulnerable to external threats. And Islam is introduced in the 14th century. So right at the tail end of this period, because this period goes to 1450, Islam arrives, and it arrives peacefully through the trans-Saharan slave trade. Now, when we talk about West Africa and East Africa, these are states that become integrated and far more dependent upon Afro-Eurasian trade than even the Hausa kingdoms. So the two West African states we can talk about are Ghana and Mali. So Ghana is kind of is right at the kind of falls at the tail end of the period we're supposed to study. So they're not really important to what we need to know, other than like they start these continuities that are really important to Mali and eventually Songhai in the next period. And so West Africa has access to a lot of luxury goods like gold and ivory. And so these are things that are not unique, but far more plentiful and therefore less valuable in Ghana or West Africa than they would be to other people, right? Because ivory, is this like commodity that can be used to create like art. Gold is, not only an aesthetically valuable thing, but also a thing that you can base your currency off of. And salt, actually, what they get for this is like salt, copper, cloth, and tools, things that they didn't necessarily have access to based on the climate or resources available to them. And salt is actually something that is down. Maybe you might not comprehend how important salt is in human development and human structures. Salt is actually the Latin root in our language for soldier. It's one who's paid in salt. Because Roman soldiers were paid in salt because of its value. You can use it for preserving meat. Salt is also really important because it helps cows and cattle digest their food and stuff like that. And so salt gives them really important nutrients in that way. And so that's what the Ghanans are really interested in. And they had a king, which then is different from Hausa because it's not necessarily kinship. It was initially kin-based, but then evolved to something beyond that, where a king was no longer administering over people who they were related to even tangentially. And they used iron weapons. And a nobility, which we know these are people who were apportioned authority by the king of Ghana to rule for him. Now Mali comes after Ghana. And the difference between Ghana and Mali is, while Islam is coming in to West Africa during Ghana's period of supremacy, Sundiata, the leader of Mali, is a Muslim, or probably a Muslim, which means that Islam and politics become integral to West African states with Mali, and the connections that begin with Ghana become stronger under Mali. Eventually, kind of like the emblematic moment of the Malian period in West Africa would be this man Mansa Musa, who is a king. I believe Mansa is monarch in the language of Mali, and he goes on his Hajj because he's a Muslim, and it's a massive journey. He has a whole baggage train that follows with him. He crosses the Sahara. He comes with all of this wealth from all this gold he has, and when he spends it, you can follow Mansa Musa's Hajj based on the inflation that occurs in even like really wealthy economies like Cairo in Egypt experiences a period of inflation because Mansa Musa spends so much gold. There's more gold than there's supposed to be, and that means that the value of everything goes up to kind of meet with the surplus of gold. But and Timbuktu is a center of Mali, and it's also a center of culture. That structures like the Mosque of Djen are built also around Timbuktu. So they're doing monumental art and architecture that you learned about when we did that Unit 0 lecture. I hope Jones and Rappaport spent time with that. Now, if we travel all the way down to the barrel of the pistol of Africa, we have Zimbabwe. And it's right around where the country of Zimbabwe is today. It's not exactly there, but if you just go like north of South Africa and a little bit to the east, that's around where Zimbabwe is. Zimbabwe means in Bantu dwelling, and it was not as complex or integrated into trade routes as the other states we just talked about in Mali and Ghana. Zimbabwe, though, has in this heartland of southern Africa access to gold and ivory, which again were harder to get a hold of in other parts of the world. But while Mali and Ghana are integrated in the trans-Saharan trade route, Zimbabwe has an origin point of Indian Ocean trade. So all these goods, merchants from the coast of Eastern Africa would go inland into Zimbabwe, purchase goods, and then move eastward and sell those goods on the coast. And so Zimbabwean goods, gold and ivory, would spread to Arabia, they would spread to South Asia, and even would get up to China sometimes. So kind of a consequence of this trade between Zimbabwe and the rest of the Indian Ocean Trade Route Network would be the development of this language Swahili, which is most of these merchants who are trading along the East African coast are Arabic and Muslim, because, remember that the Quran is in Arabic, and so even if you're a Muslim who doesn't identify in the Arabic cultural group, you actually might be pretty familiar with Arabic in general because of your religion. And so the Bantu language and Arabic mixed together because these people are spending so much time with each other. You have Bantu speakers converting to Islam, therefore learning Arabic, and then this pidgin language develops that eventually becomes Swahili, which is spoken along the East African coast to this day. And the city kind of that's like the central, the urban center, but again, it's not a city as we understand it. Several thousand people, I think around 10,000-ish, 20,000 people lived in these cities around this period of 1200 to 1450, which is not big for city standards in the rest of the world, but still relatively large for what we have in African cities, is Great Zimbabwe. And eventually it's abandoned because of some stuff that we're still not entirely certain of. And kind of the other kind of outlier here that is different than these other three states would be Ethiopia. So Ethiopia is significant because it's a country that is Christian majority and actually maintains its Christianity even as it becomes integrated with trans-Saharan trade and Indian Ocean trade. It's a more centralized state. Christianity comes to the Ethiopians through interaction with the Romans, through Mediterranean trade routes. And so Ethiopia is a kind of continuous state. It's relatively more centralized than other states. It's Christian, but also maintains a pretty distinct separateness from the rest of Christianity or Christendom until much later, until we're talking like, European adventures into Africa leading up into imperialism and stuff like that. So we're going to the social structures of sub-Saharan Africa. So sub meaning below. That would be so these would be, we're talking about like West Africa, the Hausa kingdoms, Ethiopia, Zimbabwe. The three ways that society was divided or how people were seen as different from one another would be kinship, age, gender, and then distinct. And often you wouldn't deviate outside of your ethnic group that much. So the diversity a person would experience would mostly come along how you were related to someone, how old they were, and what gender they presented as. So typically young adults were expected to do the physical labor, while elders eventually, as their bodies began to be less productive, were seen as sources of wisdom and advice. Men dominated specialized skill-based labor, like trade things like pottery making or blacksmithing. Women farmed and gathered food, but also provided domestic labor like child rearing and maintaining the household or the complex. Often families in parts of sub-Saharan Africa live in these larger collection of dwellings. We could call them like complexes, where it would be like aunts and uncles living like in the same kind of like in a series of buildings together, with like, it's not like a nuclear family model that we have where it's the parents and the child live separate from extended family. Often families are integrated with each other in these dwelling style systems. Now, what's distinct is there was a slave trade that was very pronounced in East Africa. The West African slave trade becomes really prevalent and far larger in scale when we get to period 2, 1450 to 1750, and that's the slave trade that you might be familiar with, what we call the transatlantic slave trade. Typically, slaves in this slave trade of East Africa were POWs, debtors, and criminals, and that's even continuous with the African interpretation of trans-Saharan slave of the transatlantic slave trade. And in a lot of ways, slaves are seen as a marker of wealth. Land might not be held by the collective, but people who work the land could be owned. They could, and most of these slaves were driven by demand for labor in Southwest Asia. Actually, another really interesting kind of Southwest Asian kind of, it's the kind of the gravitational center of the slave trade before 1450, in Dar al-Islam, which we talked about in 1.2, that slavery is different in Dar al-Islam than it is in how it manifests in the Americas in the 15th, 16th, 17th, and 18th and 19th centuries. So these slaves are working for a temporary period of time. Often, if they convert to Islam, they are freed, they are manumitted. But also, slaves are not coming from just from Africa. Not just as many, but a good portion of slaves are coming from Northern Europe and Eastern Europe. And actually the term Slavs, which is the term that we have for the larger ethnic group of people in Eastern and Southern Europe, that's where we take the word slaves from in English, because so many of these Eastern and Northern Europeans, modern day Russians, were also used as slaves in Dar al-Islam as well. Sorry for that short tangent about Slavs and things like that. But these African slaves, when they moved into the Middle East, they would work on sugar plantations, which is continuous with slaves. You'll learn about that later. And then in Basra, which is a city in modern day Iraq, along the Tigris River, African slaves revolted in the Zanj rebellion. I think Zanj is slave in Arabic. I'm pretty sure it is. And for 10 years, these slaves ran this region until it was put down by a leader. So it's an example of a successful slave revolt that for a period of time. And there's very few slave revolts have ever been successful. The Zanj rebellion might be one of the more successful ones. We'll talk about Haiti in about 2 months, which is probably the most important revolution in human history. I'll stand by that. But we'll get there when we get there. For culture, we have some really interesting things that happen. So when we talk about the importance of writing, and I think when you did that Shark Tank activity paper and talked about writing and the value of memory is something that is why paper is so valuable. It becomes paper a lot and makes writing become an extension of our memory. It can hold information that our brains might forget. And in sub-Saharan Africa, writing systems don't develop as we understand them. Like, of course, symbols exist that have meaning, but not like, a coherent thing where symbols either take on a phonetic or symbolic meaning where one can have like a syntax and a written language. But in general, art had a lot of spiritual and religious meaning. It was a mean of connecting with ancestors. A lot of these religions worship ancestors, and in addition to types of animism, worshiping nature and things like that. Art from in the area of Benin, which is in West Africa, becomes so significant that the British love it so much they steal all of it and put it in their museums, that even today Africans are asking for their art back because it was just taken without their permission back when Britain had control of a quarter of the human population. The most interesting thing to talk about would be these griots and griots. So the increasing complexity of society demands a kind of record keeping. Okay. Writing is a form of record keeping, and there are advantages to record keeping in writing form, because if you write things down, you can put that somewhere safe. You don't need to worry about remembering it, and you can pull it out and anyone can access this, right? Americans, like Native Americans or Indigenous Americans, come up with a different system, specifically the Inca, beyond writing. But in sub-Saharan Africa, this skilled labor becomes it's a group of people known as griots or griot. I think it's griots. Griots are guys, and then the one with the es is with are women. So it was an oral tradition. It was someone's job to remember everything that was relevant to a community. And and you'd think that, oh man, people's memories are really, really sketchy. Like, I can't remember what I had for breakfast yesterday, but people whose job it's really impressive. And there's still griots out today. So these griots had a lot of they would tell the story. So these griots, their job would remember things and memorize things. They would tell stories dramatically. They would tell stories through song. They are living texts in a lot of ways, which means that they had agency. It would be like if a book had could do what it wanted. So a griot had influence because they could choose how a person was remembered. You would be kind to a griot, you'd honor a griot, you'd respect a griot because they had control over how your ancestors, your successors would remember you. And because they knew so much, they would be seen as advisors, right? That could also provide an interpretation, right? It would be like a book telling you the theme of the story, right? And then, and you think again, human memory is flubbed, but griots exist today, and there's a really famous account. I won't go too deep into it, but Alex Haley is this African American author who found the name of his ancestor, who was taken from America to become a slave in the southern United States. And when he learned the name of this man in 1970, he eventually found the village where Kunta Kinte was taken from. He arrived at the village, he found the griot, and the griot told the story of the community. And actually, his ancestor, Kunta Kinte, was in that story. And in that perspective, he disappeared from the story and was never heard from again. But the griot knew the date from down to the day of when Kunta Kinte, Alex Haley's ancestor, disappeared. And that's how powerful these people's memories are, when it's like their whole job to do that. So that's all we have for Europe. For Africa. And the next slide, I'm going to try and kind of bustle through this one, because it's very long, to talk about Europe.